Today's guests are Leah Rothstein and Joel Dock. Leah is a nationally known housing policy expert and co-authored Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, which released last year. Just Action explores what we can do in our own communities to begin to challenge and redress segregation. Leah has 2 decades of experience as a consultant to nonprofit housing developers and local governments, and as a community and union organizer. Joel has worked at Louisville Metro Government for 11 years and is currently the planning supervisor within the Office of Planning. He will help contextualize zoning changes in land development code in the Louisville area throughout our conversation. Joel actually worked on approving permits for our domestic violence transitional housing program years ago. So let's jump right in. Leah, hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Good to be here.
I really appreciate you taking the time, and I really look forward to this conversation. And Joel, you as well, thank you for being here in studio today. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and it's connecting the two of you as well, because I know that you've connected with each other over the years, and Louisville sounds like has a strong connection to Leah and the work that she does as well.
I would say there's definitely a relationship between the work that Richard Rothstein put in The Color of Law and this new book, Just Action. There's a lot of there's a lot of high level stuff in the Color of Law book and the Just Action book, and here at the local level, we've tried to put that unique spin on how all of that relates to what happens here in the city of Louisville.
Well, that's fantastic. So, Leah, let's start with you. As Joel mentioned, your dad, Richard, wrote The Color of Law, sold almost 1 million, maybe more than 1 million copies. And I was reading somewhere as well that it had a bit of a I don't want to call it resurgence, but there was a lot more attention that were put into it in that summer of 2020 as folks were dealing with a number of challenges across communities. And for our listeners, the Color of Law was focused on how federal, state, and local governments gave rise to and reinforced neighborhood segregation. Just Action, which was co-wrote by Leah and her father, Richard, is a sequel to that. So you all are a wonderful duo working together in this area. How did this all come about? Tell our listeners how the Color of Law came about, and then the sequel.
Sure. Well, my dad actually came to writing The Color of Law through working on education policy. He was a journalist and, writer, researcher about education policy, and he was focused on the black-white achievement gap, why there were disparities in educational achievement between black and white students around the country. And that brought him to looking at segregated public schools, why schools are segregated by race, and how that has a large impact on the outcomes of the students in those schools, and started to dig into why schools are segregated. And he remembers, a decision by Chief Justice John Roberts for a sort of trivial school desegregation case where the Supreme Court said that the federal government or local, any form of government has no role to play in desegregating public schools because it had no role to play in creating segregation. And he remembered, stories that he had heard of how government at all levels had sort of enforced and created segregated communities. So he started to dig into, why are schools so segregated? It's because neighborhoods are segregated, and neighborhoods are segregated because the government at all levels created and enforced that segregation. So he wrote The Color of Law to sort of lay out all of these dozens and dozens of examples of how local, state, and federal policy intentionally and explicitly created racially segregated communities. And he really wrote it to dispel the myth we have as a country that we live in a form of de facto segregation, that we're racially segregated in our neighborhoods because of, personal preference or a naturally occurring phenomenon or just an accident. And, he really debunked that myth by showing it was no accident. It was purposeful government policy that created that segregation. So he wrote that book. It did have a wave of new interest in 2020 after George Floyd's murder, because people were looking around to see, for explanations of why we're so polarized racially as a country, why our communities are so racially homogenous. They found a lot of answers to that in The Color of Law. Now, I, like many readers of The Color of Law, read it, and I was, blown away by the just level of evidence and the explicitness of this like horrible history of our government in creating segregated communities. And I asked him, like many other readers did, now that we're reckoning with this true history of how we came to be segregated, what can we do about it now? It feels intractable. It feels almost impossible to affect change around. We've come to accept that we live in a segregated society and there's nothing we can do about it. So I asked him, what can we do about it now? And he challenged me in return and asked me to help him write a sequel to The Color of Law to answer that question. So I brought my policy experience and knowledge, and he brought his history and journalism experience, and together we wrote this book to show that, there's a lot that we can do, especially locally. We focus on local policy changes and programmatic changes that we can advocate for in our own communities to begin to challenge and remedy the ongoing consequences of segregation.
I like to say that I'm a student of history. I'm a voracious reader. And I was reading an article that you were being interviewed on, the importance of teaching history. Facts are facts. We can all have our own opinion or our own whatever on, a particular topic, but facts are facts. And what you're describing there, it's a fact. Policy was such that it created the unfortunate circumstances that you're talking about. But I also like the fact, though, that you and your dad take kind of the approach of teaching the history, not to kind of hammer it home and make people feel bad, but to understand it is what it is. It is what it is. And then you've got, the sequel with Just Action, Take Action. And can you tell us a little bit about some of the the key findings from Just Action in terms of what can we do? I mean, we need to learn about the history. We need to understand about where we've been. I mean, we can all see also just in Supreme Court decisions over the history of the country that were just bad. Doesn't mean that if they have a decision, it's a good decision. Just bad decisions,
Exactly.
And so talk to us a little bit about what, the findings of Just Action and just some of the more important things that we can be doing.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that it's so important that we base all of this in an understanding of the history. If we continue to believe that we are a racially segregated society by accident, we think that we can only undo it by accident. We have no agency, we have no responsibility to do anything about it. But once we understand the history and we can see that our government took unconstitutional actions, they broke the law in maintaining and creating segregated communities, we see that we have an obligation and a responsibility to remedy that. And then we can also start to see that if intentional action created this situation, intentional action can undo it. We have some agency back in the equation. So what we focused on that, sort of basing the understanding of what our role can be to challenge segregation on the history of how we got here. And then, even though, as The Color of Law shows, the federal government had a major role to play in creating segregated communities, once that segregation is created, to a large extent, it's enforced and perpetuated by local government policy. So we, also base our sort of findings and arguments in Just Action on the understanding that we don't have the federal political will right now to make changes on the national level that can really affect change in the segregation of our communities. We don't pretend to think that we have that sort of political consensus on the federal level, but we can build that on the local level. And there's a lot that we can do locally to begin to challenge and redress segregation. So we outline dozens and dozens of policies and strategies, from zoning changes to reforming how the Housing Choice Voucher Section 8 program is used locally, to starting land trusts, community land trusts, or looking at how property tax assessments are done locally. All of these are locally controlled issues, and all of them, if we look at them in the context of segregation, we can see what we can do to reform those policies and programs to undo the segregation of our communities and provide some redress for the harms that it's caused.
Our legislature is in session right now, and there's a House bill and Senate bill around source of income. And Louisville Metro Government unanimously passed an ordinance. Joel, when was that? Was that last year? It was the ordinance around that landlords can't discriminate.
I'm familiar with the ordinance, but I couldn't give you the year.
And very rarely is it may have been last year. Very rarely is it a unanimous vote on the Metro Council to essentially not allow discrimination because of source of income, and in this case, Section H vouchers. The state is working to overturn that, and we'll see where it goes. But I would presume that is the sort of policy that reduces opportunities for folks that are trying to look to move in certain parts of town, and so I would presume that's an example.
Yeah, that's a great example. The Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program is supposed to give lower income tenants the opportunity to live wherever they want because it's a mobile subsidy. You can use it anywhere in the private market. But one of the reasons why only 5% of Section 8 voucher holders can use their vouchers to live in what are called high opportunity areas, which are neighborhoods that have well-resourced public schools and clean air and access to parks and libraries and grocery stores. Only 5% of Section 8 tenants can use their subsidy to live in those areas, and one big reason is discrimination. The federal government allows landlords to discriminate against tenants if they use Section 8 to pay their rent. So this is another example. The federal government isn't helping in this situation, but local governments, over 100 local governments and 20 states have passed laws to outlaw that kind of discrimination in their own jurisdictions, just like Louisville has. And that's an important step towards allowing more mobility and opportunity for these families.
Well, we have a number of our clients at St. Vincent de Paul that utilize those sorts of opportunities to be able to find the housing that is appropriate for them, maybe close by to where their job is, which also is extremely important. So we're talking a little bit here about kind of the local side of things. And Joel, you had mentioned the Color of Law being a guidebook and a very important book. And then, of course, the Just Action being kind of what do we do and how do we go forward from here. So you're leading the city's efforts into confronting racism in city planning and zoning, and you all have looked into decisions made over the last century and what has led to zoning segregation here in Louisville. What did you learn from all that, and what are some of the things that we're doing about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking about the confronting racism in city planning and zoning. What this is it's an interactive online exhibit that details the history, really the racialized history of city planning and zoning here in Louisville. So, around the time of the nationwide social and racial justice movement following the wrongful deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor here within Louisville, it was incumbent on planners to really reflect deeply on the fact that, these types of tragedies are, so intimately tied to the built and the social environments that exist within our communities, and that public administrations, including city planners, have played a tremendous role in designing the current patterns of segregation within our communities. So what we wanted to do as a planning office was say, hey, we understand there's been a lot of work around redlining, Homeowners Loan Corporation. There's been a lot of work locally on exposing the impact of redlining on the African American communities, the deprivation of capital and of resources, the deprival of loans. And so we wanted to look a bit closer at the systems within our jurisdiction, which is land development regulations and planning. And we wanted to identify the people policy and the actors that sought to intentionally segregate our communities based on the racialized ideology that blacks themselves spread insurance and financial risk and were akin to a factory coming into your neighborhood and spewing pollution. And so the Confronting Racism in City Planning and Zoning, online exhibit exposes this racialized history of planning, beginning as far back as the racial segregation ordinance that was passed here in Louisville in 1914 that would ultimately be decided by the courts in the case of Buchanan v. Worley. This segregation ordinance was based on the idea that, whites and blacks should be separated and the city should be divided into, a series of checkerboard squares of white and black. And so it required that, if the block was majority white, a black family couldn't move in and vice versa. Now, following this decision by the courts, cities rushed to then adopt a zoning policy that can pass constitutional muster. So they aren't overtly racist on their face. And so professional planners then come on board. We identify one such planner named Harlan Bartholomew, who's known as the Dean of City Planner. He very much believed and brought forth policies, ideas, and plans that reinforced the ideas that the communities needed to be segregated by race and income. As we talk about, how they did this without actually, saying, okay, we're going to create zoning and we're going to zone this area for white and we're going to zone this area for blacks. They used the relationship between zoning and federal and state policies to interconnect them all to create multiple systems in which African Americans and other non-whites were deprived of the ability to choose where they could live. They were removed from the existing communities where they lived, urban renewal, and they were denied opportunity because the federal government, as is pointed out in the Color of Law, worked in conjunction with tightly controlled single-family subdivisions to put, in their manual for lending that there should be a deed restriction on the racial occupant, on, the race of the intended occupant. So what we outlined in our story map was specifically that the local government and local planners and the planning profession has played a tremendous role in creating our current patterns of racial and socioeconomic segregation. And what's interesting about what Leah presented and about why the Color of Law was started, I was familiar with the history of this court case of schools, and it's interesting that that's brought up again, because where statements could be made that were overtly racist were in sectors of the city that were segregated, schools and parks. And so we look at what they said, specifically the language that they used around how they would divide the city, build the city, and in the section that's talking about school sites, they say that schools should be abandoned, and they give 3 reasons. And this is Harlan Bartholomew, this is 1931 Comprehensive Plan. They say schools should be abandoned for 3 reasons. 1, it's on a major thoroughfare. 2, industrial uses are replacing residential uses. And where I quote, Negroes are gradually displacing the white population. Then they proposed school sites in the periphery areas of the city, in the eastern edges of the city, that would then be insulated and isolated by heavily restricted exclusionary single-family zoning. Therefore, the individuals that would go to these new public schools would be only white individuals, and the schools in the predominantly African-American communities would be abandoned.
I took some time last week to, go through what you all have online. It's shocking. It's right there in print.
Yeah, the first step that we always argue is just, for any city to do this work and to move forward with policy, that is to have any positive impact on equity and inclusion in the future, you have to acknowledge the roles that local governments have played, and you have to confront that head on.
You all are doing some things out there to communicate to the public, and some of it's in a fun way. I see you brought some Legos.
I did. I brought Legos with me today.
I don't see any kids here. I just remember when my kids were growing up, I hate stepping on them with my bare feet. But tell what do you have here? What did you bring in? I find it very interesting because I also see kind of a neighborhood on the table there as well.
Yeah, so, the first step is confronting this racialized history of planning, and then, make changes. Make changes to the regulations that encourage greater housing choices, greater options. But it's also about changing the way that we engage with the public. It's about changing how we communicate language in planning. We intentionally don't use buzzwordy topics like density. I can say this word to you. You may or may not know what it is. I could explain it to you. We could go around in circles about what density means, and we can all be confused at the end. Or I can tell you that we want to bring about more housing choices. Mm-hmm. We want to encourage more opportunity. That makes sense. Yep. I don't have to explain dwelling units an acre. I don't have to explain floor areas. I don't have to explain any of that. But housing choices, that's pretty obvious. It means housing choices. So we also want to change, how, we're not just out there having public meetings for the sake of having public meetings. We're not just having, okay, what do you prefer? Put some dots up on this board of what you prefer. We want individuals to collaboratively come up with solutions and have conversations about why they're doing what they're doing. And so this Lego exercise, it was an exercise that we put together called Planning for Middle Housing. And what we did was we took Lego bricks and we divided the bricks to represent different housing types. We had some single-family pieces, so these would all represent, single-family homes. We're pursuing, middle housing, so, there's concepts like cottage courts and pocket neighborhoods. Cool. We've got multiplexes, we've got parks, we've got a bus stop, we've got 10 commercial services. So what we wanted the participants to do, and planning staff was very hands-off, was in groups of 3 or 4, they assigned a clerk, they assigned, kind of the city manager that would make those executive decisions. We gave them these Lego bricks. We threw some pencils on the table but didn't really give them any directions of what to do. They asked questions about, what different things represented on these grids. So we gave them a real-life street grid from Louisville, and we let them choose between a super block or a cul-de-sac grid. And in building these without the direction from staff, we got some really good examples of how people envision their communities if their communities are built with different housing choices and opportunities. Legos are translatable for all ages. Anybody can put their hands on it. They can visualize it. They can make sense of it. One of the best experiences I had through this workshop was with a 10 and 11-year-old at the Newburgh Library. And they chose a street map grid that it wasn't a grid. It was a suburban cul-de-sac subdivision. And they built the neighborhood. Now, they didn't follow the rules or the pieces or anything, but they built the neighborhood how they envisioned a neighborhood. It had a government center. It had a pet shop. They were really big into Black Panther at the time, so all it was themed in a way. But what was really interesting that they did was they took the cottage court piece, the pedestrian court piece, which symbolizes, it's a carless street. It's got a pedestrian way through the middle. And they took it and they laid it between 2 cul-de-sacs that came together. And afterwards, we always evaluated what people did, why they made the decisions they did. And I said, why did you all put that one there? Not expecting the answer they would give me, but they gave me, what I would expect of somebody who would have, a planning degree. They said that they saw that there wasn't a connection, and greater connection creates stronger neighborhoods. And I'm like, this is a 10 and 11-year-old telling us what we know as the planning community. And how do we keep that idea with them? How do we keep that idea that they should continue to ask for connected communities? It's really exciting to see everybody engaged in something and making sense of such difficult concepts like missing middle housing.
Right. Thank you for that, and that's really phenomenal, especially when you've got a 10 or 11-year-old giving you advice on things that, like you said, you think this is somebody that has an advanced degree.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful to see people of all ages being able to engage with, with planners, with government officials. If we can do anything absolutely right as a government official, it's creating a positive experience
through the eyes of children.
Take away, yeah.
Leah, there was something that I read. Help me remember it. Taking a map and folding it in half. Mm. And then, different two parts of the community come together and learn more about each other. You talk to that. I'm thinking of that as Joel speaks here in terms of just the connection between communities, because there's so much that separates us, but we're so much alike.
Exactly. Yeah. So we wrote about this example because in Just Action, we argue that we need not only the involvement, like Joel is facilitating, of residents in the planning process, but we need community groups to come together, people from different segregated parts of town, from different races and different neighborhoods, to get to know each other and start to build some social relationships that they can then use to form groups to advocate for change on the local level. That's the only way we will build the movement we need to enact the changes to challenge segregation. And we understand that we live in very segregated communities, so we don't necessarily have natural social contact with people of other races. It takes some intentional efforts or steps to bring people together. So we tell a few stories in Just Action of communities that have done that, and one is this folded map project. It was conducted by an artist, a photographer in Chicago. Her name is Tanika Johnson. She took the unique layout of Chicago, which is laid out in a perfect grid. The north side of town is mostly white. The south side of town is mostly black. When you fold the map in half, homes sit perfectly on top of each other. They have the same house numbers, but they're on the north and south side of the same street.
Wow.
So she called those homes map twins, and she photographed the homes and did a photography exhibit to show, the context of segregation. Like, these homes aren't that different. They're in the same town. They have the same house number on the same street on the north and south side of town, but they exist in very different contexts because of the segregation of those communities. So that was the first step. And then she introduced herself to the residents of the homes and told them about her project and asked if they wanted to meet their map twin. Most of them said yes. They met their map twin. They toured each other's neighborhoods. They started to build relationships and learned that they weren't that different. They learned how different their neighborhoods were. Many of these people had grown up in Chicago their whole lives and had never been to the other race side of town or known people from the other parts of town. So it just sort of dispelled all these myths they had about people being so different from them and neighborhoods being how they are because of accident or preference. They started to unpack all the reasons their neighborhoods were very different. They then, they formed block twin groups where a whole block would team up with a block on the other side of town, and they would have social gatherings and neighborhood beautification efforts. So this is an example of, just to show it's not impossible to build these cross-race relationships. Again, this was an artist. It was sort of a socially minded, social justice minded art project. But the next step would be for an organizer to come in to these block twin groups and help them think about what they could do to affect change in their communities to address the segregation that they're learning about by learning about each other. So it's a necessary first step to bring people together to then start to work on these issues together that affect all of us.
That's great, and it really caught my attention when I was reading that today. And then, Joel, the way that you interact here with the community to help design, these are real streets, these are real maps of the city, and I'm thinking of Louisville, and we see this at St. Vincent de Paul as well, and I'm sure it's certainly the case across many metropolitan areas around America. But our cities are becoming much more diverse. We have a large influx here in Louisville of Cuban population, and from many other countries as well. With the growth in that, and refugees coming into the many metropolitan areas, what impact, Leah, does that have on your work and what you see going into the future? Because I can only imagine that we're going to continue to become more diverse, especially in the cities.
Sure. Well, as more people come to a city, especially more, new arrivals to this country who tend to be lower income, there's just more demand for housing, especially affordable housing. And they're met with communities, like Louisville and like communities all over the country that don't have enough housing to meet that demand. And in order to do that, we need to build a more housing choices, like Joel was talking about. We need to plan our neighborhoods to have a more diversity of housing type to address the need for more affordable housing, middle income housing, and market rate housing. We have to look at the full spectrum of need and demand. But right now, what's happening is, the demand for housing is growing and the supply isn't catching up. It's not meeting that demand. Now, in the work that I do, I focus, in Just Action, we focus very intentionally and specifically on the segregation of Blacks and whites. Now, the segregation of other racial minorities, the Hispanic community of new immigrants, it also exists, and there's policies and programs that enforce that segregation. But the segregation of African Americans from whites is the most persistent type of segregation. Often when Hispanic immigrants come to this country, they live in more ethnically, racially homogenous communities where people speak their language and they have more networks to find housing and find jobs. And then a generation or two later, their children and grandchildren tend to leave those neighborhoods and integrate more into other neighborhoods in their metropolitan area. For African Americans, segregation has changed very little in the last, decades in particular, since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Segregation hasn't changed much, the segregation of Blacks and whites. And so that segregation is persistent. And so we need very focused policies on the policies that created it. We need focused remedies to remedy the policies that created that segregation. Now, those remedies will benefit other racial minorities and other racial groups, but we have to be very specific on what we are solving for. And our work focuses on solving for how do we redress and provide remedies for the ongoing consequences of the segregation of African Americans that the government enacted in violation of the Constitution.
You mentioned the missing middle. Can you talk to that? What that means?
Yeah.
Because I think it's really interesting because, in our work at St. Vincent de Paul, we're dealing with folks that are chronically homeless and in transition, fleeing from domestic abuse. So, we're seeing that firsthand, folks coming off the street, but there's a whole part of our population in Louisville that we don't see. I hope we never see them because I hope they never have to utilize the services that we have. I often tell folks, I wish we could go out of business because there's no demand. But I don't think that's going to be the case. We need to stay in business and do the work that we're doing because we're saving people's lives. But there's a whole, a really significant part of our population that we just don't see, that they're one paycheck away from having a problem. But you talk about the missing middle, and I find that interesting, and I think it would be interesting for our listeners as well to know what you mean by that.
Yeah, the missing middle term, it refers to a large group of people in our country who are middle income. They're working families, they have jobs, they have incomes. They make too much to qualify for subsidized low-income housing and too little to afford market rate housing. So they're sort of missing from the equation when we're looking at housing policy. We're usually either looking at building market rate expensive new homes, or we're looking at building subsidized, quote unquote, affordable housing. And that term, I put it in quotes because often the term affordable housing refers to housing that's, affordable to the lowest income families and households. But in reality, there isn't enough affordable housing for this missing middle group either. They can't find housing they can afford without being one paycheck away from being, on the streets. And so when we're looking at our housing policies, we need to look at this full picture, the broad spectrum of the need of housing in our communities. And when we're looking at segregation and, housing access for African American families, there's also a very dangerous assumption in this country that low income and Black are the same thing, that most African Americans are low income and qualify for this, subsidized low income affordable housing, when in reality most African Americans are middle income. They have good jobs, they're working, but they fall into this missing middle category because there just isn't enough housing to meet that need for that group. And so when we're, much like the work Joel is doing with the Legos, we need to plan communities that have all sorts of types of housing in them so that the need of this missing middle group can be met by the new housing we're building, that we're not only focusing on the two ends of the spectrum.
Joel, I want you to comment on that. But before, thank you, Leah. Oftentimes I think we can paint ourselves in a corner with terminology, because folks have a view and their own definition of what affordable housing is. Right now, there's a lot of discussion going on in Frankfurt about housing first and what that means. It means something to somebody. It means something different to somebody else. I mean, for us at St. Vincent de Paul, it's about housing. It's not requiring treatment to get housed, to get safe, right? But we provide all the wraparound services that are needed for the particular individual depending on their circumstances, whether it's counseling for mental health issues or substance use issues. So I think sometimes we talk about affordable housing. I just believe we got to come up with some different terms.
Yeah, this is a conversation that we often have, and I alluded to the fact that we have to change, how we educate and we communicate with the public, and one of those things is terminology. Affordable housing can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Affordable housing can mean it's affordable for you and you and you, therefore it's affordable, but it's not affordable to anybody else. So, you can talk about affordable housing through the lens of affordable housing as measured from an area median income perspective of this house is affordable to those making 30% of the area median income, 50% area median income, or it's affordable in that market, or it's deeply affordable, or it's subsidized. The terms we use are really important because the terms that we use are weaponized by individuals to, and terms are abused. I think a lot of times in the planner's line of work, there's a lot of multifamily development proposed, and the second anybody says it's affordable, I think there's a misconception out there that every multifamily development is some form of a housing project, whereby it will be fully subsidized. It will be full of individuals on Section 8, housing choice voucher program, and that's just not the reality of housing development, here in Louisville. So, to think about terms, it's always important to think about those terms and how we use them. And what's interesting is the way that Leah discusses missing middle is through an income perspective. And I know that's how they talk about that missing middle.
Right.
We talk about missing middle as a building type and as a housing type. So when we are discussing middle housing in the context of Louisville, we discuss it as a range of housing options with multiple dwellings within a structure that's consistent with the size and height of single-family homes. So it's duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, cottage courts, and pedestrian neighborhoods. These are all forms of housing that deliver more units in a greater variation of units that is more adaptable to, for instance, our changing demographic structure here in Louisville.
Is that the ADUs? Is that part of it? Is that a middle?
Yeah, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are often seen as a middle housing. They're often that first step that you do. If you're taking action on, reforming your land use code or your development policy, often the accessory dwelling unit is kind of a low-hanging fruit. It's something easy you can do to say, we're going to incentivize our existing walkable, our built environment, because we know accessory dwelling units serve both young folks in transition, think coming out of college, in between jobs, but it also helps our aging population age in place to stay in the neighborhoods that they've been in and downsize. It gives, an individual the opportunity to move to a cottage unit in their backyard and rent their whole home to a family. What, ADUs have been so important for here in Louisville, and where I see them continue growing, is in our foreign-born population. We've got 8% foreign-born population, 10% speak a language other than English at home, and our foreign-born populations are, more so than the traditional single-family homogeneous home. Multi-generational living exists, and there are great models for multi-generational housing where, mothers, kids, grandparents, they all live and work together, but they may need separate independent space because they do have their own lives. So we have to evolve our land use regulations with our changing demography. And land use regulations have historically been written to prevent the diversification of areas, to maintain a homogeneous pattern, in turn, under the idea that wealth needs to be protected, and that wealth needs to be protected in predominantly white affluent communities.
Leah, you mentioned, thank you, Joel. Leah, you mentioned in an interview that I read about Menlo Park, and I think it was in that interview where there was a discussion around building housing for school teachers, and initially there was pushback on that. And my dad was a school teacher. My two daughters are school teachers. So we talk about affordable housing. Oftentimes, it's folks like school teachers. I mean, so when we talk about it, what are we talking about? And I know that the community, and I think it was Menlo Park, eventually did the right thing and ensured that the housing could be built.
Yeah, right. That's an example of sort of both meanings of this middle housing.
Yeah.
Housing built, with more housing options and, in a single family only area that was also more affordable to middle income households. So it was a community, Menlo Park in Silicon Valley in California, very expensive community, mostly single family homes that, over $2 million, I think, was a median home value in that community. And teachers in a nearby school district, 30% of them left their job every year because they couldn't find housing anywhere nearby. And so the school district had an empty site in Menlo Park that was vacant, and they decided they wanted to build housing to house the teachers in their community. So affordable teacher housing, 90 units. And the community opposed it. Some people in the community, in the neighborhood, opposed it. They put a measure on the ballot that would block not only that 90-unit development, but any future development that wanted to rezone from single-family zoning would have to go before the voters to be approved. So it would essentially make any future middle housing or more dense housing in their community really difficult to enact, to pass. And so there was a group in that community called Menlo Together that had started by doing a training, a workshop throughout their area about how they came to be a segregated community. They called it Color of Law Menlo Park Edition. They outlined all of the, much like Louisville has done, outlined the whole history of government policies that created the segregation of their communities, and formed a group of concerned, active residents who were interested in this issue and wanted to see a more diverse area where they lived and more housing accessibility for people who worked in their communities, like their teachers. And so when this measure got put on the ballot, they launched a campaign to defeat it, and they went door to door and talked to their neighbors, and they ended up defeating it because they really understood the context that this measure was sitting in, which was an exclusionary history of keeping their community very affluent, very white, and they didn't want to continue that and perpetuate that. So they defeated it. It's a great example of, oftentimes when new, more affordable housing is proposed in a community like this, people oppose it. And those of us who sort of don't agree with that opposition feel like there's nothing we can do to promote the developments and allow it to go through. But it's a great example of that the support for this kind of housing and inclusion and accessibility in our own communities actually does exist if we go out there and find it. So the people in this group, Menlo Together, they went door to door every weekend to canvass for defeating this measure, and it worked. So even in a place like Menlo Park, we can find the support we need to advance housing access and affordability in our own communities. So that I wrote about that in our Substack column because that happened after the book came out. Yeah. Otherwise, it would have been included in the book.
Right. No, there's hope, right? And when folks can see what the facts are, they understand. And that's a great example. I've been to Menlo Park before, and so it's just wonderful to hear that. It's wonderful to hear that story. We could spend the rest of the day talking. Time has just flown by.
Yeah, we could very easily.
Right. We're at the end of our time. So, Leah Rothstein, thank you so much. Joel, Doc, thank you for being here. And I love to hear more about the connection between you all and the work that you're doing and the impact that the work that you're doing, Leah, is having here on Louisville, Kentucky. We love our community. We know that, no community's perfect, but we're working on it. And Joel, to have you here working and doing the things that you're doing, it just makes me even that much happier.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've got a very dedicated team of planners working to, change nearly 100 years of harmful planning policy.
And where can folks go to get more educated on what you all are doing here locally?
So you can go to louisvilleky.gov /LDC reform, or just Google Land Development Code reform here in Louisville. We've got a website that outlines what the reform is. We have our third consecutive year of public conversations at the library beginning on March 5th at the Southwest Library. We're doing about a dozen of these. They're every other week on Tuesdays. We'll have a schedule going out, but these are opportunities for the public to come into the Louisville Free Public Library location nearest them and have a conversation, candid conversation with a planner.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Leah, I'm going to make the presumption that folks can find Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation, enacted under the color code very easily if they go online. And I encourage folks to do that. Is there any other sources that you would direct folks to as well, in addition to that book and also The Color of Law?
Yeah, sure. So we have a website, justactionbook.org. You can find links to purchase both books on that site, and you can buy them both wherever books are sold, online or in bookstores. We also have a Substack column, which is like a free newsletter where we're continuing to write about things like the Menlo Park story. And Joel has an upcoming guest authored column about what's happening in Louisville, because it's been so impressive to me. I wanted to share it with all of our subscribers. So folks can subscribe there at justaction.substack.com. Subscribe for free, and then you get our newest newsletters delivered to your inbox.
That's great. Thank you. Leah, Joel, thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.